Hello world, I'm Evan Gudmestead, an instructor of application and web development at Rankin Technical College. In today's tutorial, we will be building an app that I can demonstrate for you today. It's built in .NET MAUI, which is cross-platform Windows apps, Android apps, iOS apps. So you build one app that runs on multi-platform. This particular, it's a pretty simple app that does CRUD operation on what are referred to as user entities. And so we can add new user. Of course, CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. We have a read operation out of a database going on our app. We can add new users. We can edit those users. And we can delete those users. And again, all of this is being stored in a SQLite database, and we could do the same thing in our Android app. But if you stick through this tutorial, not only will we be building this app, but let's get into the weeds about what you will learn. So here are some quick learning objectives about what you will learn if you stick through this tutorial. Again, down in the weeds, of course, .NET MAUI targeting .NET 9. We're going to be working with Entity Framework Core with SQLite. We are going to be working with dependency injection, and so we'll get some theory around dependency injection and how we can use it in our .NET MAUI apps. We're going to implement what's referred to as model view model design pattern, a very popular pattern for data binding, our user interface controls and the code behind. We're going to work with asynchronous C#, and so we'll be coding async await patterns, very common thing to do in 2025. Of course, we're going to do our standard CRUD monkey operations on a SQLite database. We'll have some responsive layouts that can work on multiple app platforms, and of course we'll be doing some error handling with try catches. So that's the app we're building. These are the learning outcomes. I hope you enjoy. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, if this is your absolute first MAUI app, you've never built or run a MAUI app before, you will need to install all the tools, and I will link to I don't even know what it's called, a card, but I'll link to it on the video here. You'll see it pop up where I have a guide of installing all the proper tooling that you will need, including the Visual Studio templates. And so it's Visual Studio Community 2022. And if you haven't done this before, make sure to click on that and follow that tutorial. It's actually a pretty good step-by-step tutorial. So if you do have Visual Studio 22 installed, let's go ahead and boot it up and create a new project. And if you've installed a MAUI app before, you should have this template for .NET MAUI. Otherwise, you can kind of filter by C# and Android, and you'll find it in the list if you have it properly installed. And where this goes on your computer, I'm going to put this in MAUI tutorials, wherever you want to put it. You can kind of click through. I am teaching MAUI to my class of C# students for the first time, so we just wind up putting things in different chapters. We happen to be around chapter 15 right now in my class, so sure, we'll put it in the chapter 15 folder. Just wherever you put it, be aware of where you put it. Number two, I've noticed that this location, the path, if it gets too long, I've noticed that causing some different issues. So if I were to do over, I would get this closer to the root of my C drive so that my overall file path doesn't get so long. But this should be fine for now. Again, if you have some issues that I don't have in this video, you might want to look at that file path being too long and put this maybe on your desktop because that shortens this path quite a bit. And I'm going to call this CRUD and we're going to be doing this on users. And so you can call this whatever you like, and I like to place the solution and the project in the same directory. So those are my settings. And we're going to be using .NET 9, which is been around a while now. Let's spin that up. Okay, now where I like to start is with Entity Framework. And so Entity Framework is what we're going to use to integrate a database. Entity Framework is really great for working with different kinds of databases. In fact, you know, a lot of my background is working with on Windows machines, and when you install Visual Studio Community, you get SQLite. You get SQL Express. You get SQL Express, and that runs only on Windows. And so a little learning curve that I had is that, well, SQL Express only runs on Windows, therefore you can't use it cross-platform because SQL Express doesn't run on Android. So I had to use a different database system. However, I did not have to learn anything different about Entity Framework. Entity Framework handles so much for you that it doesn't matter if you're working with different database systems. You can code the same kind of Entity Framework code, and it can handle a lot of that for you. So Entity Framework is great for that purpose. And so we're going to work with Entity Framework in SQLite. Again, that's something I hadn't done before, but it was pretty simple to do, as I've learned Entity Framework before, and all those same concepts applied. So let's go to your Tools menu and our NuGet Package Manager, and we're just going to install one NuGet package here that's going to allow us to work with Entity Framework for SQLite. And so Microsoft, and I don't know if yours auto-populates like mine did, but Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite. We're going to click on this. And you can see here it's in a pre-release version. That those error out for me a lot of the time, so I just go to the latest stable. So change this version to the latest stable. So I got .NET 9, and this is Entity Framework 9, so we have matching versions. Now notice here I click my drop-down list and it changed it back. So let's change that drop-down option again and click install. Again, this is installing basically the packages from Microsoft to enable Entity Framework with SQLite. SQLite being the database system that works cross-platform. Okay, so we got finished. If I kind of navigate over here to installed, we can see that's installed. You might have to refresh or clear your search, but nonetheless, we have the package installed. Okay, so what are our entities? What are the things that we're saving in a database? And so those are often called domain models. They're called entities. These are your C# classes. These are the things you're saving data about. So they go by a lot of different names, and that's part of it, is learning all these different names. But very commonly, you might find these entities stored in a models folder, or these things in a models. And in there, I'm just going to create my user class. And this is ultimately this user class. We're going to mark it as public. So pretty standard in object-oriented programming to have your classes marked as public. Now realize that this user class is going to be used by Entity Framework to create a users table in the database. So this is often referred to as code first Entity Framework. And you can kind of see here my Copilot is suggesting some fields, and I'm going to simplify this. I don't want all those fields. And so the more, look, I've worked with Copilots and ChatGPT for the last 3 years. And the more I use it, the more I kind of back off of it a little bit, because especially if you're a learner, you learn by coding. And so even though I have my co-pilots and I do use it, I do try and type a lot of my code, because again, you learn by actually doing the typing. Not that I don't use it at all, I do at times, but and anymore it almost gets in the way. So when we have Entity Framework, again, we're going to be creating a users table. The convention here is to either have user ID, so the same name as the class, followed by the word ID, and it could be lowercase I, but in this case it's a, you know, it's a separate word, so we can kind of Pascal case it there. User ID, camel case, excuse me. And this is referred to as an auto-implemented property in C#. And so we've got a standard get block and a standard set block. And the way this wires up in Entity Framework is that this is, and you kind of saw this is the primary key. So in the user table, the primary key column is a column that uniquely identifies each user. And if you don't set this to be anything else, this is just going to be an auto incrementing ID. So it's going to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And your users will automatically have an ID assigned. When you have a new user, it'll just go to the next ID. And that's how Entity Framework works out of the box. You can either have a user ID, or, you know, again, you could just call it ID, because we're in the user class. We know that this is a user ID, and that's fine. Now, other than that, we're just going to have one more column. So this is a column. We're setting up columns in our database tables. So this is a table. This will be the ID column, and we're going to have one more for the, just for the name. Public, this, of course, names are going to be string. Okay, now this is going to be the name column, and we kind of get the green squiggly saying, hey, if you want it to be required, consider adding the keyword required. There's a, you know, we could add the question mark here. That's one way of solving that. That makes the green squiggly go away. So now name is nullable. So if you want to make it a nullable column, you could add the question mark to your data type, and that's going to allow nulls in the database column. If you don't want to now allow nulls, you could, as it suggested, make it required. In this case, you know, doesn't matter too much. We're going to go ahead and say, let's make it required. So what that would do is it would set up the design of the database table that if you do not have a name, that database will throw an error. Okay, and you would have to catch that error in your C# app. Okay, but really simple model here, just again, because this tutorial is geared at more beginners. So we're going to have 2 columns, 1 table, keep it real simple to learn Entity Framework. All right, again, just to spell this out, this is a required name column in the users table. This is a primary key column in the users table. Okay, now I actually have to create the users table. One more thing, I will refer to this as a user is a domain model. Okay, so there are different kinds of models. Again, a model is another word for class. In this case, a C# class. And so a domain model just means that it ties into a database. There are different like view models, right? View models are obviously for the front end, whereas the domain model is a model for the back end, for the database. All right. So the next thing I want to do is create what's referred to as the context file, the database context file. And this database context file is a very important file that essentially links the database to our C# app. And so it kind of plays a middleman role of linking the app to the database. Again, just being that middleman, if you will. And so I'm going to put this, it doesn't have to be in its own folder, but I'll put it in a folder called data. And I'm going to add a C# class called data context. Now we're going to mark this as public. Pretty common to mark your classes as public in object-oriented programming. And what we do here is a little bit of inheritance. We inherit from DB context. Of course, that's going to error out because we have to add a using statement that says, hey, we're going to be using Entity Framework Core. Okay, so Entity Framework Core is the package, the dependency that we installed that has the DB context class that we are now inheriting our class from. So this is a child, data context is a child, DB context is the parent. And there's two things that we're going to do in here. The first thing is we're going to build the constructor. So a constructor is, of course, a method with the same name as the class. And so public data context and DB context options. So there's a real standard data context options base options, and I'll explain this as I write it. Empty. Okay. So this constructor is a required constructor for dependency injection. And we're going to explain dependency injection in just a little bit. But for now, actually I'll just put required constructor in my notes. So again, constructor is a method with the same name as a class. This particular method has one parameter. That parameter accepts a generic class called options, context options, with the data type of data context. And all we do is we take that one parameter in and we pass that up to the parent constructor. So base is DB context, and we pass this options up to the parent. A lot of this is just happening in the background. Anytime you instantiate a data context, you're going to send in some options up to the context, and I'll explain what those options are here in a little bit. Okay, and then this line again that it's suggesting here is our actual table. So this line is an auto-implemented property called users. We need to bring in using CRUD users models, right? That allows us to bring in our user model or domain model. So this is now a recognized type. So DB set just says, hey, we're creating a table of individual user objects called users. Okay, so this actually will create our database table. And that's all for now for this data context file. So let me go ahead and save that up. And let's open up our kind of the starting point of the app is the MAUI program.cs. And so you can kind of see here, this is a static class called MAUI program. There's a method here called create MAUI app, and in here that method has 4 references, so it's called in our main application to boot the application up. Okay, so what I'm going to do here after the fonts, so again we have this line 9 says MAUI app create builder. So we have this variable called builder. We're going to use this builder variable to work a little bit more with our data context. So we have our data context file, but we have to be able to use what's called dependency injection to work with it in our XAML files and in our code behinds. So here's how we're going to do that. Okay, so we're going to use builder.services.add DB context, and our DB context is called data context. Now we have to bring in a using statement, so that's recognized. So if you just double click that, that'll actually bring in a using statement up top for CRUD users.data. Here are those options I was talking about just a little bit ago. So let's clear this out. Okay, hit enter. Put a semicolon at the end here to make that happy for now. Options, arrow, curlies, var db path. I'll explain this. That looks correct. No, that's not correct. Data source, use SQLite. We need to have another using statement, which is Entity Framework Core. So let's bring in using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And when you bring in Entity Framework Core, now we have this method of use SQLite that we can configure our options with. Again, remember those options that I said are passed up to the parent constructor? That's what we're saying here. Pass these options, which basically the options say use SQLite. SQLite is our database. If we break down this code, we have different apps. We have different platforms on .NET MAUI. And so where you store the database, these different operating systems have different folder structures. Therefore, I don't know the folder structure of all these different apps. And so we write a little C# kind of a concatenation, right? We're combining whatever the app data directory is of the local file system. That file system should have a property app data directory, each one uniquely defined of where to store the app data. Okay, and our unique database name in this case here is called users.db. So that's the file name of our database is users.db. Put it in the file system location for the app data. And that's our DB path. And then we tell SQLite, this is our connection string for SQLite. This is about as simple of a connection string as I've ever seen, because all we're doing here is defining the database path to the app data and the file name. Okay, so again, this line here is dependency injection for the data context. If I could explain that just a little bit, okay, dependency injection. Normally, in C# or in Java, whatever, object-oriented, you're going to learn, build a class and then instantiate that class. So in the case of a user, if we were to instantiate this user, you might say user u1 equals new user. Okay, now that's a line of code that, hey, we learned to make a class, and then we learn to instantiate that class. Dependency injection allows C# to do the instantiation for you. You no longer have to actually write the line of code to instantiate an object. If you enable dependency injection, what we're doing here is we're allowing at runtime data context, which is our database class, we're allowing that data context to be instantiated automatically for us and used inside of our code behind file. Excuse me, I'm clicking the wrong thing. Like for example here, our main page, we're going to allow our main page to accept an object that was instantiated for us at runtime. We didn't have to write the code to instantiate a data context object. Okay, in fact, I'll show you the line of code that allows us to do that inside of the main page constructor. Data context. Again, we have to bring in the using statement called data, whatever our variable name is here. Okay, so now data context is recognized because of line 1. Okay, so line 9 says, hey, whenever we construct our main page, again, the main page is the boot up page. This is the first page. Pass in to that main page, pass in a data context object, and I didn't have to instantiate that. I didn't have to say data context, context1 equals new context. That happens at runtime by the runtime environment. And then we can now, in this constructor, as it's kind of implying here, we can instantiate a field. Let's go ahead and delete the count. Let's delete this because we're not going to use that. And essentially, now our main page can interact with our database. That's the short version of it. Because we made the data context, we injected the data context so that our code behind files can receive that object and work with it. We'll come back to that. I'm going to go back to here because there's one more thing I want to do in our MAUI program. I like to seed data, just provide some dummy data at the start of the app, just so I can make sure that the database is working. I can store data in the database and I can read that data out. I mean, just thinking of like basic steps that you can take. And so there's a little bit of code that I can write here. Instead of this return builder.build. Okay, I'm going to comment that out. And we're going to write this a little bit differently. So I'm going to have a using statement. Okay, this create scope kind of is just something that goes in memory and then out, right? So this is just something that let's see. I might have to add another using statement. Let me go up to the top. I got Entity Framework Core, logging. I'm going to bring in the models. I don't think that's it. CRUD users.models. Here, var app equals builder.build. And I want a lowercase app. Now we're cooking. Okay, so we got to make a variable called app equals builder.build, and then create a scope, again, just something that goes in and out of memory. At the end of this, I'm going to return app. Okay, that's going to make everything happy. I can get rid of that commented out line. And here, is where we're going to seed some data. Get required service for data context. Okay, so we're working with our data context, and there's a method called ensure created. And so let's make sure the database is created. And if there's no users, if in the context okay, so if there's not any users, again, there's a users table, and any would return those users if they exist. We're going to add a range of users, which these are our user objects. So let's get curlies here. New user. Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Put a semicolon at the end here and save changes. Now, context, this is our entity framework, right? So the add range and the save changes in particular, the save changes, this is a method you get with entity framework, and you see that a lot in entity framework is save changes. We'll see that again. Okay, so that's our seed data. Now, it took me a couple iterations. I'm kind of second guessing myself. A lot of times on entity framework with seed data, you have to seed the ID, the number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't have that, so I'm wondering if this is going to cause me an issue, but let's push forward, and if it causes an issue, we will fix it. But just something I've seen in the past. So this should create our database, seed some users, save the changes, and we're ready to proceed. Obviously, now that we have the database created, we need to read those users out one at a time. And it's worth, I'm just going to mention, with Entity Framework, in my experience in the past, spent a lot of time doing what's called migrations at this stage, where during, this is referred to as design time. We're designing the app. We actually create the database here at design time, not while the app is being run. The way this is actually structured, the database is created during runtime, and we're not actually creating the database at design time. I spent a lot of time with migrations in MAUI, and I was able to get them to work, but it didn't seem very user-friendly, and I didn't wind up with that solution. So our database is created at runtime. I found this much easier than working with migrations. Again, I got the migrations to work, but it was kind of a gnarly process. And that's why I'm wondering if this actually is going to cause issues or not, because I went through several versions of this to land where I landed. Let's go to the main page, XAML. So these are all our user interface controls, and I'm just going to start by deleting all of our main page controls, and we'll do some XAML coding here to build out this basic scroll view is the parent vertical stack layout with some spacing and some padding. Okay. So here's my vertical stack layout. I'll have a little label here, a says user management. Give it a bigger font size. Center horizontally. Okay, now what I want to do really is just read my users. Oh, by the way, this is tricky sometimes. It shows me the /, but make sure to type that. Sometimes that's caught me a time or two. It looked like it was suggesting the /. It looked like it was there, but it wasn't there. I didn't actually type it, so be aware of that. And so, okay, we have a list of users. We're going to need to display them, and the control for that is a collection view. So we're showing the user list. Okay, so the collection view. Now I'm going to come back to this because in the code behind, we need to set the binding context. Hello.
Hi. Okay,
so what you do by setting the binding to this is basically setting up the MVVM pattern to say that your user interface will be bound to the code behind and have access. And so I always got to keep pausing, and then I lose my train of thought because someone walks in the door and I'm going to talk to them and pause. But to jump back in, we set the binding context. That's setting the MVVM. It's just setting up binding. And so by changing the front end, it would change the data, or changing the data would change the front end. So MVVM is just basically getting a view model and a model view set up with binding. So they work back and forth together. So let's set up our data context and a list of users. Now, public observable collection of type user called users. Get set. And then what we'll actually do is initialize users. So here we initialize our field. Our underscore data context is equal to the data context that was injected into this page. So we're initializing our field here. And then we're also initializing our observable collection to an empty Now that's an interesting line that might simplify, but new observable collection of type user, and I did not initialize it this way. So I'm gonna, okay, so here, again, I think when you're learning C#, you learn lists first, and then you learn hash sets and all these other types of collections. When you're newer to MAUI and MVVM, you learn that instead of storing our user entities in a list of users, to work with binding, you have to store it in an observable collection. So I just think of this as my list of users, same kind of difference. And now we need to load our users out of the database, which I actually wrote an asynchronous method to do this. So I'm going to put the keyword async. Okay. And An async method, I have a little comment here. Async methods are used to perform asynchronous operations such as database access. And so, you can send a request off to the database and that database might respond quickly, it might not. So while you're waiting for the data to return from the database, you kind of want to free up your app to continue to operate. You don't want your app to kind of be hanging. And so this is a performance reason why I wrote this method as asynchronous, because we're loading data out of the database. We don't want to be waiting on a slow database. And then it says, without blocking the UI thread. So asynchronous methods, their benefits will allow the UI to remain responsive while waiting for the database operations. And so that's why I wrote this method as such. Now, so here's our load users method. At the end of the day, we're just going to call load users here. And this is going to run in an asynchronous fashion. And we're going to put, because we're loading data out of a database, that database might give us an error or an exception said differently. And we're going to put that in a try catch block. And if an exception comes back, instead of crashing our app, we will call an asynchronous method with the await keyword. So since, when you write an asynchronous method, you can call asynchronous methods with await. And this is the display alert error. So our first parameter just says error. The second, I guess you would say argument, failed to load users with the error message. And the third argument is an OK button, or OK text, OK string. Okay, so here's load users. If there's an exception, display that in an error. We are going to await our, so now we're interacting with our data context. Again, think of that as the middleman between the database and the front end. So our underscore data context. Database ensure is created. Okay, so make sure the database is created. Okay, so we are going to get the users out of the database. Let's bring in Entity Framework Core. Here on line 3, add that using statement. So we can, so this data context has a method to list async. So we're hitting the users table inside of our data context, and then we're reading them into a list. This method would return a list of users into our users variable. So if you wanted to just do something like list of user, that would be the data type. However, for simplicity, we could just say var. We're going to loop through our list for each var user in our users list. We add that user to our observable collection. So there's not a method to return an observable collection out of Entity Framework. Entity Framework can only return a list. So here's our list of users. We loop through that list of users and add each user to our observable collection. Again, the observable collection is what you need for .NET MAUI and MVVM. Okay, so now we've theoretically got our users loaded out of the database that we seeded way back when. Have not run the app yet. because let's just display those users now. So back in the main page XAML, we have a collection view that's going to display our users. Now we set the binding context, so we can say items source equals binding users. Now users is accessible here. So our observable list of users is public, and it's accessible because of this line right here. Our front end can access users because it's set as the view model, if you will, or the MVVM. So this is accessible to our front end. So our collection view is displaying that. Now let's, for each item, we're going to set a template, collection view, item template. And we will have a label. We'll put this inside of a grid. Wait a sec, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Item template, data template. Don't forget data template. All right, we're going to set up a grid with some padding. So a little positioning here. Column definitions, star, auto, capital A, label, grid.column, column 0, text is our next. So each user is going to have a name binding to the name field. And if this works, we should be able to read, we should be able to read our user's name. Now don't forget to close the grid, close the data template, item template, collection view. All right. Let's spin it up and see what breaks. So I started it up with debugging. You could start it without debugging. It always takes a little while to spin up the first time. And it's a Windows machine that will boot up. Okay, so that's good. We got it to boot. Obviously it's not displaying our users. As I suspected, maybe the C data is off. So just as a point of troubleshooting, we can maybe put a breakpoint in and just kind of watch it kind of step through the code and kind of step over. And so let's see if context.users.any. Okay, so it did return some users, right? So I do have some users being created, because if the context, if it doesn't have any users, it would run that code. So presumably it ran it last time, and then return app. So that's good. I think my database might have been created, and so now I wonder, so that to me says the database has been created okay, but it's just not displaying the data quite right. So let's put a breakpoint in here. And in fact, I'll put it up just a little bit higher. And I'll hit continue to jump to my next breakpoint. Okay, so we hit that line, stepping into loading users. The database is created. users to list. Okay, so now this is a really good point because here I see my users. So this is really good. So probably just not displaying them properly. So I'm adding my users to my observable collection. Awesome. Okay, so what's going on? Binding to the name. I do see an extra curly. I don't think that's breaking anything. And it's not. I got another problem. Okay, I see a mistake that I made where I put this label inside of my scroll view, or excuse me, inside of the oh no, that's right, collection view. That's not it. Okay, I found my bug. It deals with this main page constructor and the order of operations. If we kind of just go through this, first we set the binding context, then we initialize our instance field, and then we initialize our users to basically an empty list, and then we load our users. I'm going to change this data context to go first. So it's just order of operations, and it made all the difference. And so then I'm gonna set my users, and then I set the binding context to make those users available to the front end, and then I'm gonna load the users. So just changing those lines of code, their order of operations. The way I see it is, you know, this becomes available on line 18. At which state now we run the app, and we could see our users being loaded out of the database on our front end. Okay, now that we have the read operation up and running, the next easy ones are always add and delete. The edit is always the more complicated of those. So let's just go to the add. Okay, so here we've got our method for loading users. We can kind of condense that. Our constructor is now working the way we want it to. And let's jump into the main page, back into here, and underneath our label, have an add user section where we will have a vertical stack with some spacing. A text box, an entry control with a name of name entry, placeholder content that says enter user name, and a button with a clicked event equal to on add user clicked. If you give your button a name, you can wire it up a little easier. But on add user clicked is a method we now need to make in our code behind. So I'm going to copy that method name, go into our code behind. Now an event listener has a very standard signature for the method. Is going to be private. We're going to make an async method void. I'm going to paste in on add user click. It accepts an object called sender and event args called E. So the sender is the button, and event args is additional information about the button click. So think of it as the control that initiated the event and the additional information about the event. Start off with a little if statement. If is null or white space the name entry text box. So if it's the text box is left empty, what are we going to do? We're going to display an alert. Error, name cannot be empty. Okay, so 3 arguments being sent in, and return breaks us out of the ends the method early. So we would end the method early. If there's an error, display the alert, end the method. Otherwise, we're going to have a try catch block. Try and catch exception EX. And failed to add user. EX.message, okay. That looks remotely similar. Probably missing one curly there. Okay, so this is going to be where we actually put the user in the database in this try block using our data context. And so as we use data context as that middleman to read the list of users out of the users table, we're also going to use data context to add a new user and save the changes. And so that's what's going to happen inside of this try block. So we'll go ahead and spin up a new user object. Okay, and we're going to use an object initializer to initialize the name property, trimming white space on both sides of the string. So here's our user object. Again, you could put it as a user, or be if you want strongly typed C#, or if you just want more of a looser typed C#. We got var new user. It will figure it out for you. Thankfully, Entity Framework does allow data context to our users table, a very simple add method, the new user object that we created, and call save changes, await data context save changes async. Anytime you can write an async method, it's a good thing. Okay, now we need to update the UI. So after we save it to the database, which we've done here, now we need to update the UI. So we're going to say users.add new user. Again, users is our observable collection. Clear the field, name text is an empty string. So clear the UI text property and give an alert, some sort of feedback. All right. Give it a shot. Close it down. Spin it up. Always takes a minute. Okay, so now we have our controls. We got Dylan. Dylan's added to our database. Awesome, so we have add user. So now let's work on delete user. It's going to be pretty similar. back to the front end. We're going to pull in a delete button, and that's going to go inside of each user. Okay, so we have a grid, and we're going to add we got a grid with 3 columns, so the delete's going to be the 3rd column. So we're going to do a button that's going in grid.column of 2, which is our 3rd column. The text is delete. Background color red. Text color white. Command parameter. Okay, so if we think about this, we're looping through a list of users, and on each user we're showing their name. And so the command parameter sends into the method the user that one iteration of the loop is working with. So basically, when you click the delete button, we're going to call a method, and binding dot here sends that user into that method as a command parameter. So the user object will be sent into the method. So when we say binding dot, that's going to send that user into the method as a command parameter in that event args e variable that I was talking about earlier. And on delete, user clicked is our event handler. Let's throw in a closing. Okay, so here's our button. Put it in the column. It's a delete button. We send the user into the method called onDeleteUserClicked. Let's go to our code behind. Private async void onDeleteUserClick object sender event args e. All right, let's code this out. Okay, we can use some of these newer keywords in C#. We could say if the sender object is a button, we're going to call it button, and if that button has a command parameter that is a user object called user2delete, we will call it user2delete. So this is keyword says, hey, if the data type is a button, then create a variable called lowercase button. And if that variable lowercase button has a command parameter that we just got done talking about, if that command parameter's data type is a user, then create a variable called user2delete. That is a neat syntax that is newer to me. So here we're going to show confirmation dialog box before deleting. So say bool confirmed await display alert. Confirm delete. String interpolation. Are you sure you want to delete this user? Called user2delete.name. Question mark. Let's put these on different lines. Comma. And then we could say yes and no option. Got an extra curly there I don't need. That breaks it all. Okay, and if confirmed is true, if it's not confirmed, we return user canceled the deletion. Otherwise, here's our database operation. Our database operation is we're going to put in a try catch as it should be. Catch exception EX. Failed to delete the user if our database throws any exceptions. Give the user the error message. And inside of try underscore data context dot users remove user to delete. Save the changes. Await data context. Do it in an async method call. It's always better. And then, so that saves the database's changes, and then finally update the observable collection. So users remove user to delete to update the UI and display an alert. User deleted successfully. Line this up properly. That closes the if. I'm hanging. My Visual Studio just decided to reboot. I was missing a curly. It was really unhappy and rebooted itself while I was on pause. However, now my curlies are lined up properly. And now the Visual Studio is playing nice again. Let's boot it up and delete a user. Okay, so now we got Dylan over here. Or you want to delete Dylan. User deleted successfully. Awesome, so we can add Dylan back. And delete Dylan again. Doing good. Last but not least, edit. All right, let's bring in that edit button, which looks real similar to that delete button. And you can mess with all this positioning if you want any changes on the UI. Button. Grid column is 1. Text is edit. Background color orange. Text color is white. Margin, a little bit of spacing around. Command parameter, same thing. Send that user into the method so that you can use the user in the method. The user that is in fact being edited on edit. User clicked. Put in your closing. This is the method name, so let's wire that up on the code behind. Okay, private async void. Let's see if I can be faster than you. I could type pretty fast, but I couldn't beat it. Object, oh my, cut it out. Sender. Keeps jumping my screen down. Event args e. Man. Probably pretty smart and can figure out what I've been doing with my try catches. You know, I have enough precedent set here that it knows what I want to do. So let's just walk through it and see if it works. Ugh. Same if statement that we had on delete. If the sender is a button and that button's command parameters data type is a user, create a variable called user to edit. Same if statement as before. Now this doesn't. Yeah, we're looking good. So new name. So here, okay, so we have a variable called new name, and it says enter a new name, and it's going to display the user's original name. So all this is a prompt. It's displaying the user's original name, and then what returns from that prompt, it goes into a variable called new name. And that new name cannot be empty or white space. And then here's our database operation. We update the users to edit name. So we update that name equal to a trimming of the new name, and then update the users table with the user to edit. And this is how we update the interface. So that updates the database. And here, by updating the users collection, and again, I know that there's, using a view model, there's a better way arguably of doing this, but we update the observable collection by updating the user in the list. So find that user's position in the list and then update that user in the list and then give them a success message. Otherwise, give them an error message. So, you know, if you're going to accept a big chunk of code like that, at least walk through it and make sure you understand it. I don't mind doing it at this point because it's taking all the code that we've already written and more or less writing a modified version of that code. So there it's displaying the current name, returning that to the string, updating the user interface, and updating the database. It's clearly updating the interface, and if I reboot there, it's updating the database because the data persists after rebooting the app. So there's our CRUD operations. To kind of, at the end of this, review our objectives and make sure we hit on everything. We did create a .NET MAUI project with .NET 9. We did work with Entity Framework Core and SQLite. We did work with dependency injection. We did work with MVVM. We did work with asynchronous database operations, and we are Code Monkey pros, and responsive layouts, of course. This is responding to the width, just kind of built into the layout controls, so we did that. We got try catch blocks, and I suppose the last thing to demonstrate is this working on an Android emulator. So let's go to our Tools, Android Device Manager. Let's boot up our emulator and display this app working on Android. Now it's going to display my old app. It's just the way it works. It always displays, this was my original code base, but to redeploy, we're just going to hit the play button here, and then that'll kind of minimize itself and relaunch. And it always takes a little bit of time. But I'm going to keep the recording going because it'll redeploy, and you can kind of see in the output It'll run a deployment process. There we go. New one's popping up. We'll get our seed data in there. I still think this is my old app because the seed data was booted up again. Seed data didn't look right. Now that splash screen comes up, I think this should be that's funny to me. Jane Doe. Oh, I am running my old app. How'd I end up with that on over there? Goodness. I had the wrong Visual Studio pulled over. Dork. If you made it to this point in the video, let me know what a dork I am for making that mistake. We are almost there. We are rounding third. There we go. So now we've got the new seed data. So it's not just the old app running, and we got CRUD operations. Again, hope you enjoyed this. I enjoyed making it. Let me know in the comments below.